Indigenous people are very, very good at telling horror stories, in large part because we are living in one. Indigenous people worldwide are collectively traumatized by colonialism, Western imperialism, theft and destruction of land, and attempts made to either assimilate us or exterminate us. Our cultures and languages may differ, and our communities may be on opposite ends of the earth, but where there are Indigenous people, there is always a history of horror. But what makes Indigenous horror as a genre so unique? What sets it apart from other horror stories? Where does the inspiration to tell such scary stories come from? I'm Nahdee, and this is the Native American Horror Story. I thought about starting this episode with some good old-fashioned misrepresentation and a long, bloody history of violence. And believe me, we'll get to that.
We have such sights to show you.
But instead, let's begin with something more authentic. Horror stories and cautionary tales directly from those communities and their storytellers. Out of respect, I will only be discussing content that has been written by Native authors and has been disclosed publicly. Some creatures are so taboo that you cannot even say their names. Others can only be talked about during certain times of the year or during certain seasons. And there are stories from closed practices that need special permission to share from elders and the knowledge keepers of that tribe. As an added disclaimer, most of these stories are going to be from communities that I personally do not belong to. So keep an open mind, but make sure you have a couple grains of salt nearby. That being said, I think the stories that are available to us are pretty magnificent. In the later chapters of his book, The Manitows, Ojibwe storyteller Basil Johnston introduces his readers to the Nibinaabe, or the fishmen and fishwomen who live in the Great Lakes. Johnston tells the story of mermaids and mermen abducting and mating with humans.
Don't cry. I will make you happy. I'm sorry that I had to take you in the manner in which I did, but it was the only way. I knew how to make you mine.
Stories have power. They are used to teach valuable lessons and shape how we understand both the world that we live in and the circumstances that we find ourselves in. In the Manitows, the Nibinaabe steals a human from his family and forces him to be with her. He has to physically change every aspect of himself in order to become her mate. For many Native people, this is a very familiar story about forced assimilation, even when presented in this fantastical way. We understand what it is like to be taken from our homes and to be forced to adapt and change to an entirely different way of life. Stories like this present a very familiar but safer parallel to our own history. There are many cautionary tales unique to each culture and each region of the world. The dangers of the Great Lakes aren't necessarily the same dangers presented in the tundra. There, in the ice and snow, lives another creature that steals humans away for a much darker purpose.
Human child, ours to have, ours to hold. Forget your mother, forget your father, ours to hold, under the ice.
The Kalupiliuit is an Inuit creature that appears in the children's book A Promise is a Promise. It is a cautionary tale for Inuit children. In such a perilous terrain, parents use stories of these frightening creatures to keep their children from playing near cracks in the sea ice. Any child that disobeys their parents and wanders too close to the cracks may be swept away by the Kalupiluit, who lurk within the sea. Scaring your children into behaving is a common practice among parents of all cultures and all races. Believe me, I was raised Catholic, so I deeply sympathize.
Christ compels you!
No! Eve was weak. No! Her fault. Her fault. Shame. Shame.
Oh, please, let us make it stop! It's burning!
But it's important to remember that Indigenous people existed long before Christianity was even a concept. Indigenous parents had their own means of scaring their children into behaving, without the fire and brimstone, of course. In 2014, an entire team of Inupiaq developers created the video game Never Alone, which is based on an old Inupiaq story about a young girl and an Arctic fox spirit. In one level of the game, the Northern Lights are characterized as dangerous spirits that can sweep you away. This is based on the belief that the Northern Lights are the spirits of dead children dancing and playing in the sky. If you want to see the Northern Lights, you need to make sure to wear your hood when you go outside, otherwise the playful spirits will rip off your head and play ball with it.
And then she explained to me a little bit later that those are children, and children who've passed away when they were children. You don't want to draw them in too much, is what she said, because then they could play football with your head.
Don't play out without your hood on. If you don't have your hood on, the Aurora person is going to come down and chop your head off and play ball with your head.
I can just hear my dad right now.
Harry, put your hood on. You're going to get your head chopped off, and I'm going to laugh my ass off. Dumbass.
Damn. Stories have a way of changing and evolving as we move through time. These cautionary tales about spirits and monsters double as a metaphor for sociological issues that natives face today. The Rougarou in Cherie Demeline's novel Empire of Wild serves as a warning to young native girls about dangerous men, but also to the men who abuse those girls. The Rougarou begins with a man betraying a woman, and it destroys itself along with her.
On these lands, in both the occupied places and those left to grow wild, along the community and the dwindling wildlife, there lived another creature. His name was spoken in the low tones, save for swear words and prayer. He was a threat from 100 stories told by those old enough to remember the tales. Broke Lent, the Rougarou will come for you. Slept with a married woman, Rougarou will find you. Hit a woman under any circumstance, Rougarou will call you family soon. For girls, he was the creature who kept you off the road or made you walk in packs. For boys, he was the worst thing you could ever be. You remember to ask first and follow her lead. You don't want to turn into Rougarou. You'll wake up with blood in your teeth, not knowing and no way to know what you've done.
In Erika T. Wurth's novel White Horse, the ghost of the main character's mother appears and warns her about a monster called the Lofa. The novel is intentionally vague about the origin and deeper meaning behind this creature, and instead uses the Lofa as a metaphor for the true monster. The Lofa is what became of a boy who was abused by an evil man, who then becomes an evil man who abuses his family. Generational trauma transforms him into a beast in both a real and spiritual sense.
Michael rose from the couch, the scent of rotting meat growing and festering. My mother shrinking back, her father above her screaming, his face changing, becoming long, otherworldly, his form elongating, his shadow now unnaturally tall bent over here. He was the Lofa, the beast, his hair long, his teeth nightmarishly longer, his smell like nothing from this earth, the glass spilling onto the carpet as his fingernails became claws. When he turned around, his arm hit me so hard I practically flew. The pain, the regret built in his animal face the minute his arm drew back, his features moving briefly back to human.
Sometimes these creatures and spirits from indigenous communities mistakenly fall into the cryptid category. This obviously does a disservice to their origin and their cultural significance. For those unfamiliar, a cryptid is an animal or a beast that people claim exists but have no physical or visible proof of it. Loch Ness monsters, the Yeti, the Chupacabra, and Mothman are all examples of cryptids. Hopefully you can see how lumping in indigenous spirits can be problematic, especially if a non-native writer decides to use them in their work. But when native writers incorporate these spirits from their communities into their work, it changes the name of the game tremendously.
The television series Reservation Dogs featured a brief story about Tall Man, who signifies suicide within a community. While the purpose of Tall Man is kept intentionally vague, the presence of this creature is understood, respected, and even feared by the two native characters in the episode.
It's just hard to describe. It was a being. It was covered in hair. You know, and I thought it was Tall Man. Just had these eyes, and they were looking right at me, and they were glowing. It just scared me to the bone.
Instead of being a monster that terrorizes them while on their hunting trip, Tall Man is treated as a metaphor for their grief. He doesn't follow them home. He doesn't cause them pain or suffering. But like grief and sorrow, his presence is felt and known. Another example from Reservation Dogs is the show's interpretation of the Deer Lady, played by Mohawk actress and activist Ganitio Horn. The Deer Lady looks like a beautiful native woman who loves to dance at powwows and can be identified by her hooved feet should anybody care to look. But she also serves a darker purpose. As a protector of women and children, she kills the bad men, and occasionally bad women, who would harm them. In Season 3 of Reservation Dogs, we learn that the Deer Lady was a human girl who was kidnapped and sent to a residential school. After the nuns and priests murder her friend, she runs away and begs for help in her forbidden Kiowa language. Suddenly, the deer appears and asks if she wants her help. By accepting the deer's help, the girl becomes the vengeful Deer Lady that we've all come to know and love, and she devotes her life to hunting down bad men and offering guidance to other natives.
You know who I am, right?
Yes.
Who am I?
You're the Deer Lady.
Yes. Do you know what I do?
You kill boys?
Wrong. I kill bad men. But you're not bad. You're good. So you ain't got nothing to worry about. You think about your grandmother. You imagine her with you every single step of the way. You do that, you'll be all right. So I guess what I am saying is be good. Fight evil. You do that and you'll never, ever have to see me again.
Blending a cultural story and creating something new with it can be good or bad depending on who's telling the story and who's in charge of the narrative. This origin story for the Deer Lady works remarkably well, as it stays true to the essence of this creature while offering catharsis and healing to natives who were abused and killed in residential schools. We understand her desire for vengeance and the need to protect the people from within her community. We are on her side, despite how violent she is.
Would a non-native think to utilize Dear Lady in this way? If they were to use Dear Lady in a scary story, how would they depict her? Would she resemble a horned monster, vicious and merciless and one-dimensional? Who would her victims be? Is she tied to her culture in any meaningful way, or is she merely othered and exotic and ancient, and therefore dangerous to white characters?
I ask these questions because that's usually what we get when non-natives incorporate these types of creatures into their horror stories. And as many of us know, the two creatures that have been subjected to this the most are